This is Andy Revkin. In 1989, I spent 4 months roaming the Amazon rainforest of Brazil, researching the life, assassination, and legacy of Chico Mendes for my first book, The Burning Season. Mendes, raised in the forest, was a rubber tree tapper and union organizer who became an international leader of efforts to stem a rising tide of deforestation driven by largely lawless cattle ranchers and developers. When the book was first published in 1990, I made the rounds of TV and radio shows. One interview stood out, my hour-long conversation with the legendary historian and radio host Studs Terkel. Here's our conversation, which started with this haunting sound clip found by the show producers.
Those sounds you hear, they're forest sounds, aren't they? Birds and all sorts of birds and sounds of insects, and in fact it's from the Amazon forest, where perhaps more than anywhere else in the world there are so many. Millions of species of birds and flowers and insects, and of that Amazon forest you've been hearing and perhaps reading a great deal of what is happening there and how it affects us, what happens when the burning occurs, the deforestation occurs. And you may have heard of the case of one of the heroes of the tappers, the working people there, Chico Mendes, his murder, and how the whole world's been alerted to something thanks to some heroes involved there. There are a good number, but some special ones. And Andrew Revkin is an excellent investigative journalist, science writer, written a number of excellent pieces for Discover magazine as well as for the LA Times. And he was there for a good deal of time, and out of it has come the book, The Burning Season. The subtitle is The Murder of Chico Mendes and the Fight for the Amazon Rainforest. And let's start the beginning, Andrew. How you became involved with these sounds represent what?
The most glorious collection of biological diversity on the planet is in the Amazon. Maybe I'll set the scene by just drawing a bit of a mental picture of how big this place is, first of all. If you think of the Amazon River Basin as an area the size of the United States east of the Rocky Mountains, you have a good idea of what we're talking about. Think of the United States east of the Rockies as a single river valley that, with about 8 feet of rain dumped on it each year, so much rain that it forms a river that's 11 times the volume of the Mississippi. And the rain also nourishes this incredible assortment of life. It's an unparalleled reservoir of life. One tree has been found to harbor 1,500 species of insect. Now that's not individual critters, that's types of creature on one tree. And that doesn't include all the other things hanging on that tree. There might be dozens of different kinds of orchids, bromeliads, which are relatives of the pineapple, even cactus. There are cactus floating high in the canopy of the Amazon rainforest. And you look at one creature there, and then that creature is home to dozens of other creatures. A three-toed sloth, a mammal of the canopy.
So how many species are there? I take it more than anywhere else in the world.
Yeah, it's
species of what? Of animal, insect, birds, and flowers.
Right. An acre of Amazonian forest may contain 200 different tree species, and that's just tree species. Scientists really, in the last 10 years, they've raised the estimates of how many species are there by a factor of 10. It used to be they thought, well, maybe 2 million. Now they're saying maybe 10 million, and maybe more.
So when one tree falls, it somehow has an effect far beyond the fall of one tree, doesn't it?
That's right. And we have to remember, too, that the dynamic biological activity there has produced thousands of different chemicals, compounds, that are all part of this natural interaction of different species. It's sort of like chemical warfare constantly there. Every plant there produces compounds that fight insects, that fight fungi. And it turns out 1 out of 4 of our drugs that we use, that you look in your local drugstore, has some ingredient derived from tropical plants. So when we incinerate even an acre down there, we might be incinerating.
And so we're coming closer and closer to the humans involved here, the forces involved in this thing, and how it affects us. Even in 1988, there was talk, wasn't there, of an incredibly hot season beyond, and the word greenhouse came into being, didn't it?
Well, the way I got involved in this book really was that summer I was covering the greenhouse effect as it was unfolding. This was the first year You know, I had been writing about the greenhouse effect as many other people had for many years, but this was the first time that the man on the street looked around him, mopped his sweaty brow, and said, something is going on here. I mean, there was one day, June 23rd, 1988, when a scientist testified before Congress that he had calculated the greenhouse effect was happening now. That same day, 45 cities from coast to coast had temperatures over 100 degrees. And the burning of anything, whether it's coal or gasoline or trees in the Amazon, contributes to this. And that it was that same year that people looked at the Amazon and they estimated that 1 billion tons of carbon dioxide was being pumped into the atmosphere every year by those fires.
So what happens down there, what has happened down there, and may or may not happen down there, affects us here in Chicago, say,
That's right.
or anywhere else in.
That's right. The atmosphere is a continuum. It's a,
Let's go back then. It's called your book is called The Burning Season, and that has a meaning.
It sure does. When I got down there last summer of '89, just about a year ago, the burning season was just starting to get underway. The heart of it is from August to October, at least in western Amazonia. And this is the time when ranchers and small farmers set alight everything that they've chopped down earlier in the dry season, and everything gets nice and dried out under the sun and burns very easily. And my introduction to the burning season came one night as I was driving out to Chico Mendes' hometown, Chambéry.
We'll ask about Chico in a moment.
Yeah, I hitched a ride in the back of a pickup truck, and we're bouncing along this road in the darkness, and I look up ahead, and on both sides of the road, almost to the horizon, all you could see was this glowing landscape. It was like driving through the raked-over remains of a campfire. Everything was glittering and glowing, orange, and it was like hell, basically.
So one man's burning is another man's destruction of livelihood.
Well, that's the basis of the story, and the conflict that killed Chico Mendes was this battle between...
Oh, now we start.
Yeah.
Who is Chico Mendes? His name is now becoming internationally known, certainly among environmentalists.
Yeah.
Shall we start the beginning, don't we?
Yeah, he started out life as a rubber tapper, a seringueiro.
We're talking about a town in Brazil.
Right.
Seringueiro means rubber tapper.
Right.
Now, what's a rubber tapper do?
Well, his grandfather and his father were both rubber tappers also. Rubber tappers go out into the forest every day before dawn, and they take a circular trail, 8 miles or maybe 10 miles long, and each rubber tree that they pass, they slash the bark, just a little cut, diagonal slash, and they continue to the next tree and the next and the next, and they position a little tin cup beneath each slash. Later that same day, usually, sometimes the next day, they'll walk the same trail again and harvest this milky latex that flows from these cuts. And when this is cured over a smoky fire, it turns into something that we recognize as rubber. You can bounce it on the floor. And it became the basis 100 years ago for really one of the important bases for the Industrial Revolution. Tires, gaskets and steam engines, insulation for electrical wiring came from forest trees. And these tappers, they evolved this lifestyle that was really balanced with the forest around them. If you tap a tree too much, the tree dies.
So the rubber tappers don't destroy trees.
And they call the trees their second mother, the rubber trees. So they have this respect
these
for
are
the
rubber
forest.
tappers through the years now. Now rubber comes into being, and the importance of it.
Right.
Certainly with the automobile, before the rubber tapper. So somebody finds big dough involved here.
Yeah, well,
Millions, billions.
all of the dough, unfortunately, remained in the hands of the middlemen, the financiers in the towns along the main trunk of the Amazon who sent all these guys into the forest 100 years ago. And they advanced them the tools they needed to do basic work. Their pots and pans, a couple machetes, a shotgun, and the little special knife for cutting the tree. The problem is, and they sent these poor people from the northeast of Brazil into the forest expecting easy pickings. Of course, it's not an easy life at all. Many of them died of diseases. And those who remained found themselves shackled in perpetual debt. They never paid off this. All of that equipment they were forwarded was debited from their accounts, just like the old company store in Appalachian towns.
So the place, now Chico Mendes was a rubber tapper. His grandfather, he comes from, there's a legacy here, is there not? And there's a great art and skill involved here, too.
A lot of the skill was learned from Indians. Initially, the initial contact between rubber tappers and Indians was hostile. Each perceived the other accurately as a menace. And it was only recently that the peoples of the forest, the tappers and Indians, have come together in an alliance. And Chico Mendes actually
Well,
helped
so he's
forge
this
that.
guy, a rubber tapper, uneducated.
Right.
He meets certain people along the way,
Right.
but self-educated. And he also, the rubber tappers, like the Indians, know the forest,
Right.
the life of the forest very well, don't they?
Yeah, everything around them is used, but never abused. It's really interesting. You follow a rubber tapper along, and you can see the inherent respect. They don't take too much. They take what they need. They only hunt, for example, in a certain part of the forest for a certain length of time, then they shift to a different part of the forest to let the creatures in the other section recover. And it was Chico, because of some key people he met in his life, and I relate this a little bit in the book. He met a renegade, a fugitive from Brazil's troubled south, a revolutionary, really, who hid out in the forest.
Tavora.
Right, and who learned how to tap rubber trees from some neighbors of Chico, and who, in turn, he found this young kid, 12-year-old boy, eager to learn, with little more than that, though, but the two of them hit it off somehow, and he passed on to Chico this sense of that there was more to life than being in debt all your life. And he passed on ideas about unionism and activism and organizing and how important it was to act as a group, not as an individual. And then he disappeared from Chico's life, but somehow the spark had definitely transferred.
Now, the idea of this rubber tapper, non-education, this is Chico, 12 years old, 13, 14. The rubber tappers, did they ever organize before?
Not really.
No.
They live very individualistic lives. Each family is often isolated from their neighbors by maybe a 5-hour hike through the forest. They developed a certain self-sufficiency, but in order to break free of the debt servitude that they labored under, they really had to organize. And timing played an important part here. Brazil had a military government starting in 1964, and by the mid-'70s, the government was loosening up a little bit. They realized they couldn't maintain totalitarian control, and they allowed the first unions to form in Brazil. And this union movement spread up to the Amazon, and Chico was one of the first people to help form a union of rural workers, most of them rubber tappers. And this was the first time that the people living in the forest really did start to come together in groups, and they accomplished quite a bit very quickly.
Well, let's go back to the rubber. Whom did they work for? Now we come to other influences and a certain family, too. Chico was murdered. We know Chico was murdered. And the family, members of the family, the Alves de Silva family, they're what?
They were ranchers. And
Now, we haven't talked about ranchers.
Yeah, well, they represented a new wave that came into the Amazon starting really in the 1970s. The same military government that had control over Brazil until 1985 perceived the Amazon as just an empty wilderness that was vulnerable to attack, really. They were very paranoid about this. Here's this region. It's more than half of Brazil's territory, the Amazon basin, yet it contained just a fraction of the population.
Yeah, that was what, Colombia? No, what's...
the Amazon extends into about 8 countries, actually, that ring the basin there. But anyway, the military theorists decided they wanted to, as one put it, flood the Amazon with civilization. And they did this by starting to build a road network. They did it by doling out tax breaks, low-interest loans, all sorts of financial benefits for cattle ranchers to move up there. Now, in Brazil, historically, cattle ranchers have been the pioneers. They're the ones who settle a territory first, and then come the farmers, and then come the businessmen, and then comes civilization. So it was natural that ranchers would be the first vanguard of this. And the ranchers perceived this same forest that the tappers harvested bounty from as nothing more than an impediment, something to get rid of. And the simplest way to get rid of it is to chop it down, let it dry a little bit, and then the burning season comes.
Because they wanted range for the cattle.
Right, and Brazilian law at the time said that the best way to lay claim to land in the Amazon, in a wilderness, is to put it to what the technical term was productive use. Now, in the Amazon, productive use could mean incinerating the forest and putting out a few head of cattle. Didn't have to be very many cattle. So many of these men also weren't really ranchers. They were using ranching as just a ploy to collect the tax breaks and the low-interest loans and to sit on this land that they knew would rise in value as it became more developed. And it was inevitable that there would be a conflict between these people of the open spaces and the people of the forest. They had totally different worldviews. And the ranchers also, their worldview also included using violence to solve problems. In Brazil, the owning class, the ranching class, never had to worry too much about the law. In the South, that was true for 100 or more years, and certainly ended up being true in the Amazon. And as Chico was among those who organized a resistance to this invasion, rubber tappers started to die. Very violent, brutal deaths.
His predecessor, Wilson Pinheiro.
Right. One of the mentors who helped Chico further into this movement that Tavera had started him on. Pinheiro.
Tavera's the guy who taught
this revolutionary, right? Pinheiro was another instinctive leader. He had wonderful qualities that I learned about by interviewing everyone who knew him. And one night, again, the movement clearly presented a serious threat to the ranchers and the power elite there. And one night they set a trap for him. They sent a couple guys to the Union Hall, and they killed him, shot him a couple times.
This is pretty well accepted as the fact, but also they never tried, are they? I mean,
no.
These guys which we have to come to. Gee, we're talking to Andrew Revkin and a powerful work that reveals a great deal to us, not only about the rainforest, but about how it affects certainly the whole environment in which we live. The Burning Season, and it's published by Houghton Mifflin, and the subtitle is The Murder of Chico Mendes and the Fight for the Amazon Rainforest. We have to go into that now. And all the forces involved, perhaps a bit of the history, too, way back. It's a fascinating history of the British and the tire manufacturers. Even a certain town called Manaus became a big, big town with all flamboyant. We have to talk about that in a moment. So resuming with Andrew Revkin and the Burning Season. So you've set the scene pretty well here. The history of the rubber tappers, the forest. We haven't talked about the nature of their livelihood and the way they live. And one particular person, Chico Mendes, whose murder apparently did more than just become an unsolved story of just a rubber tapper killed by the gun thugs of the cattle boys. So let's go back to the beginning. Where did Chico live? We have to come to the area now. This town, Jaipuri.
Yeah, Chapuri is one of the little towns that sprung up along this incredible network of rivers in the Amazon. There are about 1,000 tributaries, some of them larger than the Mississippi. Anyway, he lived in Chapuri, which prospered during the rubber boom early in the late 1800s. And then sort of the town fell into this quiescent period in the 1900s after the rubber boom went bust.
Why was there a rubber boom? Because the use of rubber now.
Well, it was a basis for so many parts of the Industrial Revolution, and particularly the transportation revolution that occurred around the turn of the century. There was a bicycle craze in the late 1890s, and that was founded on, there was a guy who invented the inflatable tubular tire for bicycles, and suddenly everyone wanted a bicycle. Those tires are made of rubber, harvested in the Amazon.
And then, of course, came the automobile.
The automobile was that was what really did it. Suddenly there was a vast market for rubber, and merchants made millions of dollars, again, by perpetuating this system of sending rubber tappers into the forest, leaving them in debt and collecting all the profits downstream. In fact, the further down the river you got, the richer the people were. And there were towns like Manaus, which is, in a way, the capital of the Amazon. Today it's just the capital of one state.
Now, this is where, in the north?
It's sort of right in the middle. It's
in the middle.
If you put a dot in the middle of this vast river basin, you'd see Manaus. And it's interesting that even today, it's now a city of 700,000 people, and there's only one partially paved road connecting it with the rest of Brazil. This area, it's important to keep in mind, is still, even to the heart, even to the majority of Brazilians, it's sort of a distant tropical Alaska. It's something way up there in that festering.
Manaus once had a very, very fancy opera house.
And it's just been renovated, and for the first time in recent history, there have been operas performed
Who
there.
lived there? Who patronized the opera house?
There was a whole class of rubber barons who evolved from this trade. They were getting $2 or $3 a pound for rubber at the turn of the century, and that's a time when $1 went a long way. They
What
would.
did the tappers get?
Oh, at that time, I really don't know,
Yeah.
but it was minimal.
They
And of
were in
course,
debt.
They remained in debt, partially because they also were forbidden to learn to read, so they couldn't add or
Oh, they were
subtract.
forbidden to learn to read.
Right, schools were outlawed in the Amazon by the rubber bosses, the estate bosses, because if you knew how to read and add and subtract, you could figure out pretty quickly how much you were being cheated. So as the profits accumulated in towns like Manaus, which interestingly enough, in the late 1800s was bigger than Houston was at the time, much bigger, twice as big. So the historical trends are fascinating.
Then came, what happened then? Then there was a collapse.
The balloon popped when a British opportunist smuggled some seeds, rubber tree seeds, out of the Amazon and sent them back to England. And then 22 of the seeds sprouted, and these seedlings were sent to Singapore, which was a British colony. And interestingly enough, the pests, remember the Amazon again is this dynamic, festering war zone. The things that normally keep those trees from growing densely in the Amazon, various kinds of insects, fungi, and other things, didn't go to Singapore with these seedlings. Suddenly, people found they could grow rubber trees very close together in plantations, sort of like an apple orchard. Suddenly, you didn't have to walk 10 miles through the forest every day to harvest the rubber, and quickly it became a fraction of the cost.
So then Asia produced rubber.
Asia became the center of the rubber trade, and the Amazon quickly faded into somewhat of a backwater again. There was still significant rubber trade in the Amazon, and it remained significant through...
But then came World War II.
Right. The one thing that saved the Amazon rubber trade from total annihilation was the war, when suddenly the Allies and the United States, we found ourselves cut off from access to those Asian plantations when Japan invaded southern Asia. And the only place to turn for all that rubber that we needed for tank treads and truck tires and airplane tires and everything else had to come back from the Amazon again. And of course, that was also when a crash program began to start looking for synthetics. And a new wave of rubber tappers were sent into the forest by Brazil. Brazil signed an agreement with the American government to recruit tappers, send them, and they were called soldiers of rubber. This was the rubber war. It's a strange chapter in history. So they sent these men into the Amazon and told them
Who
glorious...
were the new tappers?
Many of them came from the same stock, the same region of Brazil that the original wave of tappers came from the northeast. There's this peninsula that juts out into the Atlantic, and it's been chronically plagued with droughts for 100 years. And it's always been the source of refugees of one sort or another. It was easy for contractors to go out there and hire crews of rubber tappers and take them into the Amazon. So some of these new recruits were told wild stories. They were told... Some of them, one guy said that he was told that rubber grows on trees in 100-pound balls, and all you have to do is reach up and pick it. And so they went readily, and thousands of them died of malaria, and thousands others, those who survived, stayed in the forest, along with the remnants of the earlier tapper culture who remained there after the previous rubber boom.
So just at that, several things are going on at the same time, always were. The rubber tappers, new rubber tappers brought in and believe the myths, and then there was the boom. And then the Indians, did they tap rubber too?
There are some tribes who still do, and they taught...
What was it? What tribe? What?
The Kampa and the Kashinawa, also in Acre, the same state where Chico came from.
Acre is the state in which Chapuri is.
Right, it's the westernmost state in Brazil.
Chico's town.
Yeah, it's way out there. If you drew a line on a map straight south of Bangor, Maine, 3,300 miles, you'd be in Chapuri.
So what did the Indians do? Lived by the forest.
They tended to die in large numbers, more and more, through the 20th century.
For years, centuries, there's animosity between the Indians and the tappers.
Right.
And before the cattle came, wasn't there talk of gold mining too?
Yeah, gold mining actually didn't grow in the Amazon in a big way until really after the ranchers were already well on their way in. And it's restricted to some extent to certain parts of the Amazon. It's a terrible problem right now for a particular Indian tribe up in the north, the Yanomami. And tens of thousands of miners invaded their reservation illegally in the last few years and have brought in all sorts of diseases. And I just heard recently that The rate of Indians dying from disease right now is about 1 or 2 a day, and this is the tribe only has about 20,000 people left. It's the last, and that's the largest remaining unassimilated culture in the Amazon.
Now, the miners also had a rough time. They found out things were not what cracked up to be.
Yeah, it's not easy doing anything in the
So
Amazon.
who else came then? With the boom, then came road building,
Right.
then came construction crews.
Right. The other destructive trend in the Amazon was colonization projects that partially funded by the World Bank and other American and European private lenders, who were eager to help Brazil develop. And one prong of Brazil's development scheme was to take all of these people, several millions of people, who had been driven off the land in the south of Brazil, and move them up to, again, what was still considered a wilderness. And they said, send them along these roads, give them a little plot of 30 acres or 100 acres, and let them go.
So now we have a situation, before we were aware of environmental dangers. When was you played a big role in this, too, you and your colleagues. When did that come into the public view?
Well, in a big way, it didn't really become a big news. Of course, back around 1970, there was the first Earth Day, and there was a lot of talk about the environment at that time, but it still remained rather abstract, and problems then were visible ones, local problems. The sooty smoke coming out of car exhausts, which largely has been cleaned up now, but the issues, the global issues, really hadn't hit home yet.
And that's called ecosystem. What's an ecosystem?
It's an ecosystem, I guess, is a discrete unit of biological activity, a rainforest that has borders and that has cycles. One leaf falls, gets taken apart by ants and fungi, and comes back through the roots of the tree and into the tree again. It's
about
somewhat of a closed system.
cycles. But the global aspect was just about... But before the global aspect, when it come to visitors who came there, because a great deal of irony is involved here, too. The commercialization of it. But before that, we have a setup then, don't we? The rubber tappers beginning, through people like Chico and Mendes, begin to realize something's been wrong for centuries, for hundreds of years. The Indians knocked around and about before they coalesce with them together. We have the ranchers coming in, and we have the big rubber manufacturers, of course, don't we? And I suppose Goodyear and all those play a big role in this.
Well, only early on. Again, the Amazon today is pretty much a backwater when it comes to rubber. It's still a significant part of Brazilian industry. Brazil's industry buys a substantial amount of its rubber in the Amazon. But, so it's a small-scale trade at this point. The key development that occurred around 1980 or so, late 70s, was these tappers organized a strategy for protecting the forest that was so important to them, and we've recently learned is so important to us. They developed this aggressive action called an empate, this defense of the forest. It's like the first line of defense. When tappers would hear of a chainsaw crew coming into the forest, into that quiet place where you hear bird sounds and insects and not much else, and suddenly you hear this screeching sound and crashing of trees, they would rush and collect dozens and sometimes hundreds of people and confront these crews and order them to put down their saws and get out of there. I went along on an empate one day.
Who confronts them, you say?
The tappers would
would
confront these crews, and I went along one day with a group of 24 rubber tappers who had heard about a cutting crew. This was last August, and we marched through the forest for about 2 hours and came out to a clearing, and you could hear the saws whining in the distance. They came up to these people and said, you have no right to be here. This is illegal cutting. Let's go back to your camp and talk about this. And they escorted the crew back to their camp, and after a little while, the tappers said, okay, enough of this. You should not be here, and you must go. And then the rubber tappers picked up these same chainsaws that just a half hour earlier had been used to destroy the forest, and they turned the chainsaws on the shacks of these cutters. And within 3 minutes, literally, they reduced the shacks to piles of scrap wood, and the crews had no choice but to return to town.
But what about the guys who hired the crew? Was there retribution?
Well, right. It was this kind of tactic that got the ranchers angry. These crews were hired for a couple bucks a day apiece to do the dirty work for the ranchers.
The ranchers were cutting down these trees for more range for the cattle.
Right. And again, their concern was more to gain control over the land than to raise cattle for profit. because as anyone who's seen a cattle ranch in the Amazon can clearly see, it's not profitable. It's devastating to the landscape. After a few years, most of the pasture gets overgrown with inedible weeds, and they have to cut down more trees to get new pasture land for their cattle, and it's just a...
So we're talking about two groups of people on two different wavelengths,
Mm-hmm.
two different values
Mhm.
involved here. And we have to come to Chico and
Right.
what is happening today, and always how we're connected with it.
Mm.
All right. The burning season, and my guest is Andrew Refkin, who you can gather is in on it, very much so. Houghton Mifflin publishes this quite remarkable book. The subtitle is The Murder of Chico Mendes and the Fight for the Amazon Rainforest. So resuming with Andrew Refkin and the situation, this is the background. There earlier naturalists came there. That's true, isn't it? Sort of Darwinian type
yeah.
naturalists came there because that was a great spot for their theories too.
The great evolutionary theorists all got their start in the rainforests of the Amazon, Darwin, Wallace, and others. And ever since then, there's been a growing body of knowledge about how extraordinary the rainforests of the Earth are as a unique system. That another strange irony is, as the ranchers discovered when they cut down the forest, it's somewhat like a big green castle built on sand. The underlying soils are largely infertile. So when the ranchers cut down this dynamo, they found underneath it not much to support their activity. As it turns out, the Amazon rainforests are somewhat of a closed loop. When a leaf falls from the canopy 150 feet up, drifts down to the forest floor, it immediately gets recycled. We could all learn lessons from that, perhaps.
Yeah. But, by the way, this story, really, this battle, is almost a microcosm, isn't it, of a battle generally of forces today. Pro, anti-environmental, but using even that's a metaphor, too, for everything. For powers against powerlessness, and the powerless suddenly find a voice. And the voice in this case is Chico Mendes.
Yeah,
And back to him again.
we started to hear his voice increasingly in the mid-'80s when he made new alliances with a group of environmentalists. This was a novelty in the Amazon. Chico didn't even know the word ecology until about 1985. And these new allies were very interested in bringing him out of the forest and down to the cities of the south of Brazil, and then up here even to Washington, and eventually even to London, to tell the rest of the world that this isn't some empty wilderness. Along with being a fragile ecosystem, it's also a home to tens of thousands of Indians and rubber tappers who were living in harmony with the forest and who were the best defenders of the forest, and they needed our help. That's the message he brought up here to the World Bank to try to stop those road paving projects the bank was spending $500 million supporting, and to talk to American senators like Kasten from Wisconsin, who had the power to pull the plug on the World Bank potentially by canceling America's contribution, annual $1 billion contribution to their operating funds. And Mendes did come up here, and he did say to the bankers and politicians and environmentalists that the people who knew best how to use the forest weren't being consulted in all of these big mega projects, and they should listen to him. And he became a bit of an international spokesman. Some people compared him to sort of a Daniel Boone, who came into town from the...
What was the reaction of the World Bank?
They started to listen. There were several environmental groups in Washington who decided to wage a campaign to get the World Bank to change its ways and take into account the environmental and social impacts of these big projects, whether they be dams or roads or whatever, all around the world. And this is not just in the Amazon. The World Bank and other multilateral banks and private lenders were supporting destructive projects. And the Amazon was just one example. And this was one of the first examples of the bank listening to, or being forced to listen to, a representative of local interests, a grassroots voice. And this also didn't please the ranchers and the power brokers back in the Amazon. Chico was becoming, again, too effective by pressuring the banks to cut off loans. He was threatening another aspect of their livelihood, which was the profits they made from rising land values. If you stop the paving of roads, suddenly the escalating values stop as well. So there was clearly a decision made to start taking out certain leaders of this movement of the forest peoples, and Chico was on the list. A
List
lista negra.
these are the ranchers now.
Yeah, yeah.
And there's one particular family here in this area.
Yeah.
There's an old guy named Sebastian.
Sebastian. I had a couple of extraordinary conversations with Sebastian Alves. He was sort of the patriarch of this clan, the Alves family. They started out in the south of Brazil back in the 50s, and they developed a long tradition through 3 generations of using violence to solve problems. Even as ranchers go, they were way at the top on the scale of ruthlessness. And Sebastian told me as we sat there on his porch.
Oh, you met him, the old boy.
Yeah. We spent about 4 hours together altogether. And he's a very genial old coot with the sort of bristly little beard and silver hair. Rather nice looking. Looked like anybody's grandfather. But he very flatly told about the time he killed a guy down in the south of Brazil, and he confessed the crime only because he had a vision from God telling him to confess.
And he said that Chico just happened to live too long.
Yeah, the exact words were, Chico Mendes spent too much time alive. And then he told me, he continued to deny that the family had involvement in the murder, but at the same time he said some horrific things, like, I could read you one.
Go ahead, please do.
He said, I'll read a passage from the epilogue. As the clouds darkened above him, Sebastian denied his family's involvement in the murder. We are not violent people, he said, but if someone starts to treat you badly, to push you, to beat you, you have 2 choices. You can go look for justice, or you can find a gun and kill the man. He said, in Brazil, it's not likely that you will find justice through the courts or police. You show me a sheriff or soldier who obeys the law, then I won't kill anyone, he said. And again, it was quite clear. The subtext was all along that Chico had gotten in their way and deserved everything he got.
It was his grandson who probably did it, and his son is quite
a work of art. Yeah.
Yeah.
I met with Darlie in prison.
Darlie is the son.
Right. He's about 60, and he has more than 20 children, and several of them have now been convicted of various crimes. Yeah. Darlie said to me in prison, he said, well, my lawyer told me to just put up my hammock and rock a while. Soon I'll be out and there's no problem. And regrettably, he may be right about that. Yeah. And his son right now is also in prison. They're waiting trial. They've been waiting for trial for a while. And it isn't clear that they will actually get to that judgment.
Now, families such as these pretty much have had immunity, have they not, in the locales where they are? Because now we come to the Brazilian government itself in the past, we're talking, for the past decades.
Yeah, well, the government has been a tool for the power.
Now, there was a guy named Goulart who was knocked off. He was knocked off his job with the help of the CIA.
Right.
We know it. It's pretty much acknowledged now.
Pretty much, yeah.
And then after him, he was rather democratically elected, if I recall correctly.
Well, he was the last for 25 years, right? Then there was this period of military rule until 1985.
And it was families such as the Dalvas family of Sebastian and his children and grandchildren who had pretty much immunity.
Yeah, in the Amazon, there's not much in the way of justice. There hasn't been for a long time. There have been about 1,000 killings along the lines of Chico's killing in rural Brazil as a whole over the last 10 years, and half of those have occurred in the Amazon, even though it only has 1/10 of Brazil's population. So the Amazon is the center of this using violence to prevent the...
See, what you've done in the book, it's also a great detective story. I mean, you've done it also. You've recreated, with quite obvious, the murder of Chico Mendes, and you show even how the newspaper was owned by the ranchers.
Yeah.
How the newspaper guys of that paper were there long before others, so they knew it was planned.
Yeah, this family, the Alveses, clearly had a personal beef with Chico. He had taken away from them, in effect, a parcel of land that they had coveted. He had it disappropriated by the government and turned into a reserve. But at the same time, anyone who doubts that there were others in Acre who were also in on it need only read the local paper that was owned by right-wing ranchers. Ojio Branco is the name of the paper. And 2 weeks before Mendes was killed, a little more than 2 weeks, the paper ran a little anonymous item, chilling little item, said, soon here in Acre there will be a 200 megaton bomb will explode. This will have important national repercussions. Important people will be harmed when this is done. You can be sure that the bearer of this news is trustworthy. And then 2 weeks later, Chico was murdered. And this is not a place where there are explosive events of any kind happening with any regularity. And then, as you say, 90 minutes after the shotgun blast was fired, this team of reporters and a photographer from the paper miraculously appeared on Chico's doorstep.
By the way, it's in 90 minutes. It takes about 3 hours to get there.
Well, that's what's so miraculous about it.
Yeah.
In fact, the same night that they made this epic drive from the capital of the state to Chico's town, Chapuri, in 90 minutes, it took the sheriff 6 hours to make the same drive. Now, and I drove that stretch, or rode in a truck in that stretch, about 10 times at least, and there are potholes the size of bathtubs. And I was there during the dry season, and this happened in the rainy season when the road is half swamp. It's truly incredible that they could have
So the reporters of Rio Branco
Yeah.
got there, and I mean, they obviously knew it was going to happen.
Well, it'd be hard to find another explanation.
But now we come to Chico. Something happened that the ranchers did not expect.
Right.
Chico's murder and the funeral, and now something happened.
Well, when I spoke to Darlie in prison, who's accused of ordering the killing
of
the
the
Alves family, he said to me, I never knew how important Chico was. Nobody ever knew, he said. And it's true. In the Amazon, despite the fact that Chico had already been interviewed by reporters from papers in London and Washington, and the New York Times ran a story on page 8 with a photograph and back in 1987, and he had met senators and had become somewhat influential. In the town he lived in and in the state Chico lived in, there was still little recognition what this all meant. And of course what it meant was when that trigger was pulled, Chico's friends got on the phone that night, and within hours this network of communication had spread the word, and within days dozens of reporters from all over the world converged on the Amazon, and suddenly the forests, the larger crime as well as this murder, became the focus of the media. Unfortunately, it took this killing to do it, but this really stunned everyone in Brazil from the top down.
It's ironic, too, a great irony. Now, also, filmmakers and all others are there, too. In fact, it's
right.
battling for rights.
Hollywood descended like a plague, and the widow was wooed with all sorts of offers, and it really disrupted the movement also.
But by the way, a lot of young environmentalists and students. Who is Douglas Daly?
Oh, yeah, Doug Daly is a botanist at the New York Botanical Garden, who I ran into in the forest there. He was leading a class of 20 or 30 Brazilian students around the forest, teaching them some of those interactions that occur in this biological system, so little of which we know. And there was an increasing influx of interested people from the United States and even from Brazil as well. Botanists and biologists began to go into the Amazon in increasing numbers, and they reported these amazing facts and figures. One ichthyologist, one fish specialist, found he has personally discovered a fourth of all the fish species in the Amazon River, 500 out of the 2,000 known species. That's as many species as there are in the Atlantic Ocean, and others reported other things. This Terry Irwin, a scientist from the Smithsonian Institution, he looked at one tree. He's the one who looked at that one tree in the Peruvian Amazon and discovered it was home to, as I said earlier, 1,500 species of insect. And this reemphasized how important this area was. And
so there's a richness here that now we're coming to something that's happened as a result of the murder of Chico Mendes, the funeral, and the church. Of course, they had many of the priests who had what a base communities.
Well, the church played an important role in Brazil in organizing rural peoples and also the urban poor into activist blocks. The church had been sort of the last refuge for activists during the period of military rule in Brazil. And when military rule was relaxed, the church was the first to come out and begin to search for leadership in the communities out in the forest and also in other parts of Brazil.
So I'm sorry.
No, and they helped Chico organize tappers.
So we have to come to the last part of it. We'll take our last break. Come to what now, and also with the new regime in Brazil. It's surprisingly something that's wholly unexpected, and the appointment of an environmental minister there named Lutzenberg, who I think was very friendly to the idea of Chico Mendes. And as we come to that, we're talking to Andrew Refkin in the book The Burning Season, and in a moment, The Last Lap. So resuming for the last round with Andrew Refkin, the burning season. So was Chico's funeral seemed to be the call for the tappers and the Indians together now, and environmentalists, different parts of the world. And we also had an election recently in Brazil.
Right. I might start by just saying that Chico's murder and the funeral capped what was, again, this year when we all started to understand that things in the planet are linked, that the burning of the Amazon was a catastrophe for all of us. And then came this personal tragedy on top of it, and it, in a way, humanized the story, actually in a way that the media requires. Somehow stories have to be encapsulated.
Yeah.
And Chico's life and death did serve that purpose. But Chico's death also served the purpose of, for the first time, forcing Brazil to change its tune regarding the Amazon. And the new president who was elected and is the first free elections in Brazil since 1962. No, 60. That was the year that Goulart got elected. This president, Collor de Mello, the new one, seems to be greening, seems to be changing his policies toward the Amazon. He hired as his Secretary of the Environment an old friend of Chico Mendes and one of Brazil's leading environmentalists, José Lutzenberger, to oversee the salvation of the Amazon. And this is a government until this time, which had been bent on really just developing it, hell-bent kind of development, regardless of the environment. And even the outgoing president of Brazil, José Sarney, who had such a woeful record on almost every department, gave a going-away present to the country. He created a series of 5 extractive reserves in the Amazon. This was
extractive reserves is a phrase we haven't used. Perhaps
right.
the word explain that.
Well, Chico Mendes and his allies created this idea for along the lines of an Indian reserve, but its area set aside only for sustainable uses. The forest must stand, and you can harvest things from it, like rubber, Brazil nuts, medicinal plants, whatever, but you can't cut the trees. And Sarney created 5 extractive reserves, totaling an area about the size of the state of Massachusetts, 7,000 square miles or so. Now, by Amazonian standards, keep in mind, 2 California's worth of forests have been cut down over the last 10 years alone. So Massachusetts is a small change, but it's still a giant step for Brazil. It's like a sea change. It's really the tide has changed there, and there is a recognition that perhaps the standing forest has enough value that it should be preserved for that sake alone. So there are encouraging signs, and there's been the inkling of justice in the Amazon. 2 of the sons from this Alves family, Darcy and Olacy. Darcy is the one who's accused of pulling the trigger on Chico. But these 2 sons have now just been convicted and sentenced to 12 years in prison for a prior shooting of 2 teenage rubber tappers at a demonstration that Chico had organized earlier in '88. So it's a good sign. Again, but that doesn't mean we can be lax here or anywhere else.
So this all happened at a certain moment, too, now than more environmental anxiety and understanding. And Chico Mendes, his rise and death, the tapper. So it's an awareness. Now there's a global aspect to it.
And there are other things we can do up here besides be concerned. We have to translate that concern into action. And in the book I list there's a resource guide that lists organizations both here and in Brazil that are working with the rubber tappers and Indians to try to devise more strategies for preserving the forest and harvesting bounty from the forest.
You just read one little part of your book. Your writing is very good. Perhaps just to end it. Perhaps the last passage or some other passage you may have marked, just an example of the drama of the situation itself and the work of Andrew Refkin, my guest. The Burning Season is the book, and the murder of Chico Mendes and the fight for the Amazon rainforest in Houghton Mifflin. I suppose one last thing is the connecting link, isn't there? The fact what happens there is not removed from us anymore. This is the point. No longer is that the case.
Well, if anything points that out, it's a couple of photos that I actually got these from NASA that are in the book, that one of which shows the Amazon. It was taken from the space shuttle. It was the first flight of the space shuttle after the Challenger disaster. And one of the astronauts started snapping pictures of the Amazon basin down below, 120 miles down, excuse me. And this was at the height of the burning season, September of '88. and this picture shows a cloud of smoke the size of India.
Oh.
This is not a small
Yeah.
problem. And there was a little smudge in the center of the photograph, and that was a fire that they estimate was the size of all of the fires in Yellowstone National Park.
So we're not too far. We're not too far. We in Chicago, and he said not too far at all from the Amazon forest. What happens there, indeed, does affect what happens here. That much we know. As far as environment is concerned, we know it now. And thanks to you, we have a dramatic view of it, too. And we'll, after you read that passage, we'll hear those birds again, and those sounds and those insect sounds of life and of nature. And thank you very much.
It's a pleasure
you
to
begin reading The Burning Season, Andrew Refkin, my guest.
Well, I'll read the very end of the book. I end the book on somewhat of an up note. I think there is hope. And I met with some rubber tappers very deep in the forest, far even from where Chico had worked. And these were people who had never met him. And one, he didn't even know who he was. He thought he was an old rubber baron. They said, "Oh, Chico Mendes, wasn't he a serengalista?" Which means a rubber baroness. And we sat, and they explained why they wanted to stay in the forest. And I'll just read a little here. João and the other rubber tappers talked well past midnight, until the generators were turned off. The air had begun to chill, and condensing mist thickened over the river and flowed into the village. It was nearly a full moon, and there was supposed to be an eclipse in a couple of days. And João told one last story about the wonders of the forest that made them want to stay. At dusk one evening, he said, he was walking home along a rubber trail, surrounded by the buzz of cicadas and whoops of night birds. He did not like to hunt, and so was carrying only a dull, small knife. That's why he became nervous when he heard some large animal crashing in the brush up ahead. He crept forward, and in the dim half-light he saw a large jaguar, the biggest he had ever seen. He froze and watched as the jaguar circled and then lay down, completely blocking the trail and oblivious of his presence. The jaguar lazily rolled over, stretched and twisted from side to side, scratching its back. Now João realized that the jaguar had no intention of hurting him, and he had no intention of hurting the jaguar, but it was getting late, and he did need to get home. So finally he held his dull knife ready, just in case, and he spoke to the animal. "Jaguar," he said, "I need to pass." And the cat leaped from the trail and vanished into the forest. Now just before everyone wandered off to find a place that night to string a hammock, João's friend Antonio tried to imagine the world that the ranchers wanted to create, the world of open spaces that had already appeared in eastern Acre and was just starting to eat at the jungle along their Juruá River. He could not imagine it. His forested world was so complete that any alternative was unthinkable. If they cut the trees, how can anyone live? Antonio asked. Can you imagine a country that has only pasture and cattle without trees and man? He did not even consider the possibility that there might be men who were able to live outside the forest. That is no country. Nothing will grow there. There is no game there, he said. The ranchers will die in that kind of country. For him, and he hoped for his children, the forest was truly home. This was the fundamental bond between a man and his environment that had been the basis for Chico Mendes' own passionate defense of the Amazon. It was an intimate connection, transcending global considerations and political battles and personal conflicts. As Antonio said, the life of the rubber tapper is very hard, but it is much better than the life in the towns. It won't be easy, even with the cooperatives and the unions. We have to start our lives from the beginning, but we need to try. It's hard for me to be outside the forest. When I was down the river to the city once, I started to get a big pain in my head. It only went away when I came back and was on my trail going home.